You are listening to AccessUW, a podcast series brought to you by the University of Washington Office of the ADA Coordinator, where we highlight insightful discussions, informative interviews, and valuable insights about accessibility, equity, and inclusion, all within the realm of higher education with experts across the UW. In terms of accessibility, each podcast and a transcript are made available at the Office of the ADA Coordinator's website at www.washington.edu/ADA.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to AccessUW, our podcast. We are delighted today to have three very special guests talking about their experiences running the UW Office for Disability Services that provides accommodations for students. And I'm using that kind of vague descriptor intentionally because the name has changed over time. So to start us off, I'm going to invite each of you first just to introduce yourselves and invite you to share any information about you personally or professionally that you think will help provide some context or let us know a little bit about your positionality and how you approach this work. So I am going to start off. Diane Haynes, I invite you to introduce yourself to us.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you for inviting Kathy and me to come and speak about the history of the office that we worked in, me for 18 years and Kathy, I think, for 4. But she went on to still work in other disability resources for students' offices. So my history is just that. I was the director for Disabled Student Services, became Disability Resources for Students for 18 years. I left in 2012, so I was there from 1994 to 2012.
Great, thank you. Kathy, please introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name's Kathy Cook, and I worked at the UW Disabled Student Services was the name of it from 1994 to 1998. I have worked in Washington State with other colleges supporting students with disabilities. So I think I'm at 23 years working in higher ed, supporting students with disabilities in various capacities. So I too appreciate being here. Thank you for the invite.
Wonderful. And then I know that our speakers are familiar with Bree Callahan as our ADA coordinator, but you may not be aware that Bree served in the capacity as running the same office. So Bree, I'm going to invite you to introduce yourself once again.
Hello, listeners. So this is Bree Callahan, and in this episode, I will be serving the role as a former director of DRS, as Heather alluded to, prior to transitioning into this ADA coordinator role in 2018. I had the pleasure and privilege to serve as the director following Diane on this podcast today as the director from fall 2012 to fall 2018. So I was able to take over the DRS office at the time and then transition it to the era until I changed it, transferred it over to Dr. Jamie Cheek, who followed in my steps.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to try to follow this a little bit chronologically at first to get a sense of how the office has evolved. So I want to start with you, Kathy. And I'm wondering if you can just kind of briefly describe your tenure at the office in terms of the size of your team or the number of employees, and just kind of talk a little bit about the general vibe at the time of disability, culture, access, inclusion.
Great. Okay. So I started in 1994. When I came on, I was hired as a counselor intern. So it wasn't even a straight counselor. And the employees, there was Judy Lonergan was the director, and Sakuna, I can't pronounce his last name, was Gunbari was the program coordinator. And then they hired myself, and we had part-time hourly students and a lot of volunteers. And within 5 months of me starting, both Sakuna and Judy left. And so it was myself and student helpers and volunteers. And it was a daunting time and nerve-wracking time, but an interesting and educational time for the university. let's just say. So at that time, we were in Schmitz Hall. We were in a very small office. We were fighting for staff, just to have enough staff to be able to do all the services that we provided. We were fighting desperately for space. We did a lot of testing, and that seemed to be a huge problem, is just finding enough places to do the testing. We were fighting for respect for the office. We were fighting for equal opportunity to have, access to other departments and other places on campus, and I just don't feel like we had the respect that we needed as far as our specific department. We were fighting for groundbreaking accommodations. This was before technology. This was a whole different era in regards to the ways that we set up accommodations. We had students that came we had one student who was blind that was in a biology class, and we were literally using puffy paint and Velcro and all these, like, making physical 3D dimensions, the genetic things, all these different. So we were boots on the ground trying to figure out any way that we could make this material accessible, and it was quite a feat. At that time, there was the Disability Studies Developmental Committee was just starting. Right when I was leaving, I actually was able to attend a few of those beginning developmental meetings. And so that was really interesting. That was just emerging at that time.
Wow, that sounds like a pretty intense time period, a lot on your plate with pretty minimal staff. And it sounds like when you describe kind of making accommodations up on the fly, trying to figure out what will work for individuals at that moment. That's a lot of innovation that you're describing, as I imagine you and your team. So I want to turn to Diane then. Can you kind of pick up where Kathy left off and tell us what was the size of the group when you took over or when you joined? And did you continue on in the same kind of scarcity of resources and staff and just kind of trying to figure things out as you went along?
Yes. So I think that I came 5 months after everything. Like, Kathy was alone for 5 months when the director and Skuna left. And then I came aboard, and it was right before fall quarter. And if anyone knows anything about the office that serves students with disabilities, that's the busiest time of the year. That's when you're bringing in new students to get services that are brand new to campus and doing all the services for all the other students. And so I got plopped right in the middle of that. And you have to hit the ground running. We hired many student employees that we relied so much on students to help us with providing accommodations, and the knowledge and expertise that they had. Staffing always was a challenge. I fought long and hard after Kathy left, and we were together for 4 years. Still did not have a secretary. So we were relying on student employees to answer phones, talk with parents, students and parents that were interested in bringing their student to the UW. They were talking to student employees, and it took me quite a time in order to finally get a professional staff position for that position. Trying to get more counselors. I mean, I was always fighting for more staff. That's all I can tell you. And I never had enough. I think I started with, I got a program coordinator finally. So it was Kathy and me, and then the program coordinator. And then I finally got a secretary, probably 5 years into my time there. Very, very minimal staff. I left in 2012 with 7 staff, and now I believe Bree told me there's 14. So doubled the staff, which is awesome. Just awesome. Our budget, we had none. So that was another interesting thing. The way that the university decided to do our budget was give our office nothing, and I had to ask for anything that I purchased for the office. But the accommodation budget for the students to pay for the accommodations that the students needed was a completely different budget. And what I was told is do whatever you need for the students. So that part was beautiful because we kind of, could just go if we felt a student needed something. We went for it. And sometimes they would question us and they come back to me, what was this for? We ended up sending a deaf student on a study abroad program and sent an interpreter. And that came back with a very big, as you can imagine, for a full quarter cost. Of course, I got called on that, but I was able to explain what it was for, and they said, okay. So that part was beautiful. But in terms of the funding for the office, we were using hand-me-down chairs. We were begging for supplies. I mean, it was a very interesting time. And that's just the way that it pretty much stayed. I'll never forget one of the last budget cycles that I was attending with the other directors of student affairs. We had experienced no money coming in for the state for about 3 years. Nothing was coming in. And then finally, they were going to give us a little something. And so we all had to put what we wanted into the bucket. And so our vice president at the time said, okay, we're going to do this as a community, as a group. Let's talk about what we all need. We've all been without for a while. And everybody said, Diane's office needs money, needs staff, needs help. Give her the money. So it's like, yes, thank you. So that was good. We were laying foundational groundwork is what we were doing. I mean, the ADA had passed in 1994. That's when I started. So we were trying to figure out how to respond to that law, how to build programs that would meet the requirements of the law, would be effective for the students in using those programs, figure out accommodations as well. And we had this tiny little staff doing it, but it made us tight. I mean, we're still dear friends, and it's been a long time that we've been friends. So, it built the friendship.
Absolutely.
Well, that's really fantastic to hear. I mean, there's a couple of things that really stand out from both of your experiences so far. One is some really chronic and severe understaffing. One is an incredible reliance on student employees. So students helping other students provide necessary accommodations. And then the third thing I think I'm hearing is that there was a sense that accommodations were some kind of tangible things that could be purchased or supplied for students, rather than recognizing how important it is to have people and qualified staff who are able to implement accommodations or some of those tangible things. So that seems, or it's sounding like that was really absent in people's awareness of how accommodations really need to be implemented in ways that involve all the key players, that it's not simply a checkbox or an item that we simply provide. But before I get too far into my analysis of what you've said, I want to move us forward in time then and turn to Bree. And so Bree, if I've got my numbers here correctly, when Diane kind of stepped down as director, Diane was leaving a staff of a whopping almost 7 people, it sounds like. And then you came in, and tell us from that moment, pick up the story for us and tell us what your team was like and what the general vibe was for you.
Yeah, no, happy to. And I will have a little disclaimer here that the community within Washington State and disability services professionals across higher education was a tight-knit group. So I had known Kathy and Diane well before I took over as Diane and retired. Very nervously, I felt very much like an imposter taking over for Diane as a young 30s era of my life person. But I wanted to honor the fact that we all were working together across higher education institutions. This was what was happening at UW was happening in other places as well in terms of staffing. And so we all talk about that and learn from each other, which was great. But yes, Heather, I had the joy and privilege of taking over the Schmitz Hall location that Kathy and Judy were in, and then even I think before, maybe it was always in Schmitz, but we can get to that later. So I got to be there. It was October 2012, and actually I had 3 tasks that were given to me my first 3-4 months by the Associate Vice President Ellen Taylor at the time. One was moving the office to the location in Mary Gates Hall, which Diane under her tenure had started that whole design process and working with the capital projects and getting all that money was getting sorted out. But I was the one who got to move the office. So I got to sit in Diane's chair in office for probably 3 months before we moved everything in January 2023. That was the first big thing that I got to do, which is good. So learning a new staff, right? Just barely being in the office and moving it and navigating that. I also got to onboard a electronic case management system. So this was a request that had come out of work that Diane had done probably 3 years, like the 3 years before she retired. I know there was other connections within the university. A working group had been talking about it for a while. I got the privilege of picking, coming at the very end, right, where money was established and we just were looking for a product. So I also got to onboard what is now known as the MyDRS case management tool that we have had for 11 years on campus. But I was a part of working with that staff of 7 to vet products and do that. So that was another big thing. So we moved and we onboarded a new electronic system, moving from paper to digital. And then the third thing that I was tasked with doing, and therefore the team and I got to work on, was this relationship with faculty. So as what Kathy and Diane have alluded to, there's always been a history of tension at some point in this work, whether it was that people didn't believe the disabilities existed, because if you can't see it, it's not there, right? So a wheelchair or maybe somebody with a guide dog, that might have been an easier one, but like learning disabilities or invisible disabilities was not something that our broader campus community was as attuned to, which follows history, right, of our society too. So I was in the space in 2012 and through 2018. I really needed to go out and do a lot of work with faculty and academic departments. It was one of my top 3 charges, right, beyond the moving and the electronic format. And that was a really great way to learn the history of how DRS or DSS, right, had worked on campus. And so I got to build upon that foundation that Diane and Kathy have referenced and really try to move our relationship forward with our academic partners. I will say the onboarding of a case management tool was very helpful. Having technology to make things move quicker and streamlined and better serve them as well was a helpful piece. The move to Mary Gates Hall, also very helpful, being more centralized. And then it aligned also with growth in that community of disabled students and staff who were advocating for what is now the D Center. But there was other work happening before. So I think I might have had the best era, to be honest, in terms of navigating campus culture and climate in a more positive way. But I wish Diane and Kathy had more fruits of their labor and their experience. So those are like my first few years doing a lot of that. And then I was able to bring, I think, 3 more staff on board. By the time I left in 2018, we were able to get more money. We made the case because we had really compliance needs to be timely and manage things in an effective manner. And we were growing. I think when I inherited the office, we were serving 3% of the student body, which was very low to the national data in terms of students with disabilities in college. And when I left, I think we were serving almost 8% of the student body. So we grew 5%. I think rough numbers were like 1,150 was about when I started, and I left. We were over 3,000, maybe 3,500 students. Rough numbers, but it was a significant increase in terms of growth, and we're using data to tell that story more.
Wow, that's fantastic. Thanks, Bree. And this segues very nicely into this discussion of again, in the beginning, it sounds very much, at least starting with Kathy's tenure, that this was just scarcity of resources, trying to get the basics covered. But I'm wondering if even in the midst or maybe adjacent to that kind of scarcity, Kathy, what was your general working relationship like with faculty? You've mentioned the help of students, student employees, volunteer students. Did you have allies among the faculty, or generally characterize for us what that relationship was like for you?
We absolutely had allies among the faculty. We had whole departments that were allies that were incredibly helpful and really supportive. And some, like specifically the law school and the medical school, were phenomenal, amazing. I remember getting a call that the medical school had a student using a wheelchair and he had been there for a year and we didn't even know. And they're finally like, we've been accommodating him this whole time and we finally need your help. And it's just like, oh my gosh. So that was awesome. That was incredible. But then there were other departments that you would have thought, given their department, that they would have been very accommodating and very understanding. And they were some of the most difficult ones for us to work with, which was just really surprising. But it was really the individual students that the faculty worked with that made a huge difference, I think. I remember one time we had a student who was blind in a PhD program, and one of the faculty called one day and said that he felt like he was not discriminatory towards the student at all. He said, I feel like I have treated her like every other student, and I've, no discrimination based on her disability. And then he was doing like some huge problem on the board, and she raised her hand, and he said he called on her just thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to go back and redo this whole entire thing. And then she said, you screwed up on your formula like 4 steps back. And he said that it just floored him. He's like, he had no idea that he had that level, that he was discriminating against her and unintentionally. And I was just really proud of him for realizing that and for calling and acknowledging that. I mean, that was pretty huge. And so there were a lot of faculty that did come on board and that were very helpful. But let me say, there were some that were kicking and screaming the entire way.
And so I want to follow up, and this is a question I would direct it both you, Diane, and Kathy, in terms of, I'm thinking again of this timeline. We have the ADA passed in 1990. It takes several years for it to kind of get implemented. Then, of course, we have the judicial backlash that makes it even more complicated to implement the ADA. But we've had Section 504 in place by 1994 for, almost, we'll call it a soft 20, a solid 15 years. We've covered a lot of the history of 504 and the complications in getting that actually enacted into law already. But I'm also wondering, in your relationships with faculty or other units on campus, if there was an overall awareness of disability rights as civil rights at that time, or what your sense was in terms of the day-to-day conversations that you were having with faculty or others on campus who had a large role to play in making their coursework and their classrooms accommodating and inclusive to students.
Okay. I would say no, there was not a great deal of awareness of civil rights or of Section 504. And Section 504 did not have any teeth. So what happened, and I mean, I read many things in the offices, it would come down to sometimes the director having to just get really upset and mad, like at a faculty member, to make them do something. And then it would go up the trail to the deans or to the VPs. So there's a lot of struggle. So when the ADA came on board, then, I mean, okay, so 504 was like, you're going to lose your financial aid funding, your federal funding. What does this mean? It doesn't mean a lot to faculty, right? But with the ADA, we could say, if you do not do this, and we have told you need to do this, then you could not be indemnified by the University of Washington if the student decides to take you to court. So we had some teeth. Not that we liked to use that, because that's not really the way to get somebody to understand and really take into as a civil rights mentality why they should be making their class accessible and equitable for their students with disabilities. So we had to use that teeth. We had to use the teeth all the time, and much more so when I first started. Over the course of my 18 years, way less so, because of course, there's an evolution, there's knowledge, there's national stuff happening that the faculty are seeing, there's campus stuff happening that the faculty are seeing. But yes, of course, up until probably the day I left, there were still faculty that I was struggling with. When the learning disabilities, when students with learning disabilities started to come to campus, that was a huge educational piece for our office. Talk about going all over the place for me to do educational things, because they couldn't faculty could not understand for the life of them, how could a student with a learning, do you get this, Diane? Learning disability be here on this college campus, and you're asking me to do X, Y, and Z for them? So I had to talk to many people above faculty. Many times it moved up the chair to deans and chairs of the departments, and most of the time that's where it would stop. They would say, yes, I will talk to him, or I will talk with her, so that they understand that they need to do this. Over the course of my time, though, it really did become much less of those struggles. They were there, but much less, because there became, I always told, when I went out to do the educational sessions, and I told students, do I think it's really necessarily the work of our office, or do I think it's really the educational things I'm doing and our office is doing? No. Do you know why I think? It's because of the students. It's the students that are in the classroom getting these accommodations, many of which were very easy to provide by the instructors, and being successful and showing their potential to the faculty, and they would be blown away. Because I'd get those phone calls too from the faculty. They would call and say, I just need to tell you. And then they'd go into their story about, I started with this student, I was not happy. I end with this student, I am amazed, and I will not ever make those assumptions again. So, I had all those calls too, and that, warmed the heart. But I do believe, for the most part, we were working hard, of course, behind the scenes, but it's the students in the classroom. I really believe that over the course of the years, as there were more students, more types of different disabilities, and they were being successful, that changed how the faculties perceived our students with disabilities.
Thank you. That rings so true. That really resonates with my own experiences, both as a student and as an instructor, as a member of the faculty. And I will say that I suspect you are underplaying or not giving yourselves enough credit for the work that you've done to make accessibility visible and a common thing to be talking about on campus. And before you brought up a couple things that I want to come back to. But before I dig back into that, I want to continue this thread with Bree. So Bree comes in 2012, if I got the date right, 2012. So as we're hearing from Diane and Kathy, there is more awareness generally on campus and in kind of understanding the role of the university in providing accommodations, maybe expanding people's awareness of what disability is and the variety of different ways that people might function that need to be accommodated. But Bree, you mentioned that you came in, and one of the key focal points of your mission coming in was doing some of this outreach with faculty and working with faculty. So can you describe for us kind of that process, your experience of that process in terms of perceptions of disability, perceptions of access on campus at the time?
Yeah, happy to. So, Diane, obviously, as she's already alluded to, did lots of work as well. I think just as a new director, right? My boss, Diane's former boss, Ellen Taylor, really wanted me to put myself in front of as many people as possible just to have the transition go well. But there were also a few areas that, was continued tension, right? Diane, worked on for years, but could a new, person help that along even farther? One example was the School of Medicine, which did not have a horrible relationship, and I want to give that impression at all, but how to continue to build that moving forward. So the meeting with the dean of the School of Medicine was on my agenda the first month. I think they even had an appointment preset for me by the time I was actually onboarded and having that discussion, which went really, really well. And I mean, for me, the approach, and I know Diane well enough that I think we have a similar approach. Just might, have different ways of delivering, right? Because we're different humans. But that we left that meeting with the School of Medicine. I left that meeting feeling like there was going to be a future, partnership we're going to only enrich. They felt more comfortable with perhaps the new person, right? That things weren't going to change significantly. And I perhaps shared a vision of where we want to grow to that might, go beyond how we are currently supporting to more ways that we could support right medicine, which faculty always love to hear. How are we going to get more support, right? Versus having to always do things. So that approach that I was taking to kind of learn where are areas that either could be low-hanging fruit as we onboard this new system, that if we streamline, we're going to take away some busy work, right? That would be great. How can I help you as we onboard this new, electronic process, right? And they were like, what? You can remove this little thing that this executive assistant has to do or whatever. I'm like, yes, please tell me. So those were some really easy wins that could, really build that rapport in a positive way. And then I would say over the first few years, the other area was our testing. Kathy alluded to this, back in 1994 even, we've always had a problem with having the right space for testing. Something that I worked on after the first year. The first year was so focused on getting my DRS up and running, but then we worked in a system of having more of a proctoring service for faculty, alternative testing proctoring service, where the goal was actually to not do as many testing or certain kinds of exams, reduce distraction or extra time exams in the DRS office, but how could we reincorporate them back successfully into an academic department so the student could be with their peers, at least in the same building or in adjacent rooms, and had more direct access to their faculty. So we piloted this with chemistry and biology and physics with their general series because it was pretty easy and they had extra space. But there was work that we were doing intentionally with departments and pilot concepts. How could we really both departments, DRS and chemistry, right, or biology, how could we really partner together to create a space of inclusion as best we can while still accommodating, right, specific needs? So DRS would, on that great accommodation fund that Diane and Kathy have alluded to, right, which is a fund that the university will always have and will always fill, right, the need for accommodations. We would pay for the exam facilitators, but the department would have the space, and they would organize that stuff, and they would give the students access if they had questions, right, directly to the faculty. So we had some opportunities to work on projects, right, together to make some accommodations run a little smoother, which was great, as everybody was navigating more students, right, as well. So how could we support both sides? So I was able to build upon what Diane had established, right, in her 18-year tenure, and find some different nuances of how to meet more direct needs of faculty in some of those nuanced types of accommodations, or that at least that was the success. And I will give full credit to the My DRS system as a really great olive branch to say we have a new opportunity, right, to streamline the accommodation process, where you don't have to get as many pieces of paper, you don't have to do as many, we used to call them the gold forms. Remember that, Kathy and Diane, the gold form for the testing?
Yeah, I made that gold form.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think anybody who listens to this podcast really knows what the gold form is, to be frank, because that died when I transitioned to the My DRS in 2013. So that hasn't been around for 11 years, although it's now in our archive files. So there were things that made systems work better for people, and that we're all short on time. So I think, Heather, that was a big one for faculty. If we could make their jobs easier with this, that just helped to take a little bit of that pressure off. So I think that's my answer for you.
Yeah, well, I can't imagine. I think that approaching faculty saying, how can I make your lives easier? It's probably a very wise kind of framing of that engagement, Bree. And something that stands out to me as the three of you talk is I think many of us are often quick to question the work that maybe some of our higher administrative and oversight positions at the university do for us. But I'm hearing this theme of, often trying to get faculty to do what they needed to do meant going to a chair or a dean or a divisional dean. And so I'm just reflecting on the important kind of touchstone points throughout the structural system that helps actually, in some cases, move things forward.
So Heather, can I just add something else here that I just thought of, which is I had the benefit of Diane, you started collecting data, I think in like 1990, like one of the earlier spreadsheets. And later I found stuff from the 80s. But there was this really great master stats sheet that I discovered and only added to, where I had data from like 1990, 1991, all the way, and I just kept adding to it like every year. What are the numbers of our students? And then by each category that we were collecting per a process that the state and higher education created, right, in the 80s and 90s. So what I found also successful, what I'm adding on to here, is I would use data and I would put that in front of leaders, which helps me, one, identify, yes, we're all feeling the growth, right? And here's what this looks like, right, within your College of Engineering, within your College of Business. And while that was designed to educate and provide information and give them actually more of a clean snapshot of what's happening in foster, right, for example, or in education, it also helped me begin to talk about inclusion, because I was trying to move us not just from remediation and accommodation, but with this growth, we have opportunities to look at how can we have inclusion be discussed, right, more, so we have accessibility built in, right, in your design or your thought process of operations of how you work with students. That was part of the discussion for chemistry and biology and physics, right, taking some of their exams back into their spaces, right, for certain ones. So the wealth of data that I had, thank you very much, Diane and Kathy and Judy and Roxanne before my time. That was this amazing source to show trends and then to show within the My DRS system and the data that we were pulled from our student database, where that's showing up and trending within colleges, right? That was huge. That actually helped in the School of Medicine. We were able to get a position. We made it a senior access coordinator, and they solely worked with our health sciences professional students, which when we got that position, we had 175. And when I left, we had like 315. And that position was dedicated specifically for working with students in our health sciences, which are very nuanced. So I would say data was another piece that I really leveraged with great success, because leaders love data. They love to see trends, and they love to see how that could be a tool to solve, right, a gap.
Right. And, Bree, yeah, you're gonna, you have to work hard to persuade me of the benefit of having data, right? This is you are now speaking my language. But yes, I've also observed the way that you and the current DRS director has leveraged data and data collection in order to make, I think, more transparent the needs of the office. But I want to go back again a little bit. So we talked a little bit about the climate, if you will, or some of the environment working with faculty or getting instructors and support staff on board for providing accommodations. But now I want to ask, in retrospect, how did you perceive of students' understanding of access and accommodations? If the faculty weren't really thinking of it in terms of civil rights, I'm wondering where students were kind of coming from, what kind of language they were using, what was their overall approach or sense of getting the kinds of things that they needed to be successful in their courses. So again, I'm going to turn back to you, Kathy, if you can kind of start us off on your staff of one for part of the time that you were running the office. What sense did you have students were bringing to the table when they were reaching out for accommodations?
Well, at that point in time in the mid 90s, students that benefited from Public Law 94-142, which says how old I am, it's the idea. It was the, what was it called?
Individuals with Disabilities
Education Act, yes. So students had received accommodations all through K through 12 and then started coming to higher education. So they had more knowledge, they had more experience, they had more understanding. They came in, some of them just really, really prepared and really demanding about what it is that they wanted and what they needed. And so that was really refreshing to see. But then there was a whole other group of students that just happenstance ended up in our office, had no clue that we existed. And then, oh, I have a disability. And then we start talking about, well, these are some accommodations, and the light bulbs went off. Oh my gosh, that would make such a huge difference in my world. So there was some people that had a lot of knowledge and a lot of experience, and then other students that just didn't have any, and thankfully were referred to our office and found our services.
Yeah, Diane, what was it, a similar kind of experience for you?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. Well, the law and the K through 12 also provided accommodations that we couldn't provide. So there was an educational component that we had to do with the students that were utilizing accommodations in the K through 12 system. I would say a lot of students came to our university not wanting to use accommodations and trying it on their own. And so we would get many students coming to us at the point that they were almost near failing or knew that they better figure this out or they would be failing. And so then it was, doing some catch up with them. The one thing that was, I guess, kind of sad just about the way that our staffing was is that they had to be their own advocates. And so that was part of what we did when we went over the accommodations that they were going to utilize, was talk to them about how to go to the instructor, talk about those accommodations, how they needed, and make it more personalized, I guess, with the letter of accommodation that we would provide for them. Over the course of time, we came to realize that for some students that was just horrendously difficult, and they didn't do it, and they would maybe only do it at the time that the test came, or after they failed one test trying to take it in the classroom without their accommodation. And then they would come and we would say, well, what happened? Well, I didn't take my accommodation letter and then you stop and think about this. Here is this young student, and they're having to go to the big professor, right, and talk, and then introduce themselves and say that they have this disability and need these accommodations. That's a tough thing to do. So the whole electronic system that Bree was able to put into place, beautiful, because that took some of that away from the student responsibility. But we just didn't have the staff to call up every single professor and talk individually about a student's needs, and to a point the student has to be there too. It's individualized for them, so I think a lot of education actually had to happen for most of our students, to tell you the truth, even the ones coming in that were utilizing accommodations, because they were different accommodations in many respects than what they got in K through 12.
So, Bree, you probably know where I'm headed with this, is I'm going to ask you then, what about your impression of students' understandings of why and how and whose responsibility it is to provide accommodations in the university setting over the time that you served as director of DRS?
Well, I don't know if we're going to get to this in depth at some point, but there's always been a student advocacy thread at the University of Washington, and I know it was a part of Diane's tenure, and I'm positive it was a part of Kathy and Judy's, and before Judy's tenure. So we've always had students who know how to advocate for their rights in this area. They may not be students who come to the DRS office historically, right? They might have chosen not to, but we have many students with disabilities on campus who have historically always advocated and been very well, peaks and valleys of whether how loud they were, or how much they rallied the community. So I just want to name the fact that there's always been that. Yeah, we even have a podcast previously about this, that listeners could go back and listen to, somewhere before this episode. I can't tell you which one. So that was always there. What I will say in terms of your actual question, though, Heather, I have a similar experience both from students who were very active in K through 12 and received IEP plans or 504 plans, and they knew what they wanted, and we had to transition them to the college setting. So those were always a good portion of students. There's also, as Kathy alluded to and Diane confirmed too, there's people who become disabled while they're a college student, or perhaps their disability or health condition, became more acute, right, and substantially limiting when they were in college. Like this is known to happen. And so they didn't have experience in K through 12, and so it was new to them. And they had to learn how that works while also being a student. So we had that portion as well. One thing that I will add to this, though, is we had a lot of transfer students in my tenure. Maybe that was something that happened before. We just didn't talk about it with Kathy and Dan. But in the numbers, because you already know, I love data at this point, 30% of the undergraduate students in DRS in my tenure were transfer students, which I find fascinating. It's higher than the other populations of undergraduates in terms of non-disabled. I believe that's because it can be easier to start at a community college or a smaller school and then transfer to a bigger research one institution for a person with disability, either because of services they need to have access to, right, or being location bound for other reasons before coming to UW. So that's another subset I just want to name here, that a transfer student starts off at a different college and then has to transfer into our university system. So they're usually going up, right, in terms of the size. And so that's a different kind of transition than even high school to college. So there were struggles for that group of student as well, because they received accommodations, right, and college level accommodations, but maybe for their first or second year classes. And so they then had to learn again what this is like in their junior or senior, or if they were coming here for graduate school. So the accommodation process just keeps getting more nuanced and sometimes more involved the higher up you go in your academic courses. And so that was an area that definitely in my tenure, we had a lot of conversations about how to really make sure a former undergraduate student who's going back for graduate or professional studies, right, understands what accommodations are going to be like in those environments, because they're different, right, than Chem 101, 102, and 103, right, different kinds of classes. So I'll add that on, right, as part of this conversation. And I'll end with the stigma. So I think by the time I was director in 2012, 2018, there were society-wise, it was beginning to become less of a stigma to talk about your disability. Still was there, not going to say it wasn't there, but even now in 2024, it's even less. So I think I was, approaching this wave where students were more open about it. Self-disclosure was growing, right? Not just in students, but in our employees, slowly, right? It's different now in 2024, but even in 2012 and 2015 and 2018, it was trending up. So that was really awesome to see, and just kind of fed all the other stuff we've already talked about, right? Faculty becoming more aware, other departments on campus knowing that they also have students interacting with them, whether it's housing, right, or dining or athletics. So the conversation was bubbling up in more places about disability inclusion and access.
That's really helpful. And, it brings me also to a question that I'd like the three of you to kind of talk about or reflect on, which is the separation at the University of Washington between providing accommodations to students and providing accommodations to employees. And, some of this comes from different legislation covering different sectors. But, we've already alluded to the change in the name of DRS from DSS to DRS. To confuse our listeners, we'll throw in the Disability Services Office, DSO, here at the University of Washington. And Bree, what you were just talking about is as students progress into more higher levels of navigating higher education, that their needs can become more nuanced or complicated. But many of our graduate students, as all of us here in this space know, occupy different roles, sometimes in some spaces as students, in some spaces as academic student employees, for example. So I'm wondering if you can talk us through the reasons why, or simply the genesis of these two separate offices um, that facilitate accommodations for visitors on campus, for employees on campus, for students on campus. And I am gonna start, I think, I'm gonna start with you, Diane. Was it during your tenure that the office changed from DSS to DRS? Maybe we could start there and what motivated some of that shift.
That shift was motivated by really the starting to leave medical model to social model. And a lot of students were starting to get involved on the campus, and so there was actually a request, and some of our other partners, like in the state, were starting to change names. So it was just kind of bubbling up everywhere, and we're like, sure, we can change the name. So we got students together, some faculty together, some staff together, and started bouncing around names. And it was actually a faculty member that came up with Disability Resources for Students, Brian Dudgeon. And everybody said, you know what, that's a good one. So that's, the students liked it, everybody liked it. So that's where we went. But it was because of sort of the shift away from, having disabled a student to a person first language, a more social model. That's what drove the name change.
And so at that time, was there a separate office then for employees with disabilities to seek their accommodations?
Yeah, there always was. And I kind of don't really know the history as to why it was separate, to tell you the truth. I know that there were discussions from time to time. So the ADA coordinator that I worked mostly with was Dr. Helen Remick, and she was also the vice provost for Equal Opportunity, the Equal Opportunity Office. And she was the one that also was the manager for the Disability Services Office and did all of that. So I don't know if it just became under her hat because of the fact that she was already, the VP for Equal Opportunity and all of that. And the ADA came along and we needed to do this. So it fell under her. I would probably think that's why. And then it just became there. So there were discussions from time to time of, could we bring everything together? What I know was one thing that kept coming up in those discussions, and it happened at least 3 times in my 18 years, is the concern of blending faculty and students in the service office, that there was already reluctance for faculty and staff to identify. And if they were seen by a student possibly, or that kind of thing, heavens, can't do it. So that was one thing I do remember. And that was before we had like the electronic way to kind of enter into the world. Hello, I'm here and I need some, assistance of some kind. You did it face to face.
Oh, that's really helpful. Bree, I'm wondering about your experience as director, and I have the impression that you did work in several situations with DSO, and I'm curious what your thoughts are about the utility of separating those two offices.
Well, I first want to let Diane know that yes, that's your memory that you shared in terms of Helen's leadership aligns to documents that I found historically at the institution at one point when I was doing some research in my master's program. And I believe Dan Herdman then was the first staff member that ran DSO. Right. That name sounds familiar. Remember Jan Herdman? Yeah. Heads are nodding for listeners who are listening to us right now. I can't see our heads. So Jan became the first kind of coordinator of DSO that would report to Helen. And I'm going to just make a pretty educated guess that it's the ADA and the Title II right of employment accommodation requirement that created that office. We had an actual federal requirement there. I don't honestly know how much of the Section 503 and Department of Labor pieces would have been playing out since the 70s, maybe, but probably the ADA was definitely because of our Title II obligations. So that's some of the historical context, maybe some to help flesh out what Diane started with. In terms of my interactions with the DSO, when I came on board as director, the DSO had moved from that original office. So it was under Helen and the provost and the role that Helen had. When Helen retired, that ADA coordinator role bounced around a little bit. I think it was in medicine for a bit, and then it moved into risk management, formal name of compliance and risk services that it is now. But the DSO office, when Helen retired, my understanding, that's when Liz Coveney in HR, I don't know, Diane, if this rings a bell, there was an agreement to move the DSO office into HR since it was so much employment based. And that felt like the better fit to put it there since they were unsure where the ADA coordinator function was going to be at the point of Helen's retirement. So it shifted under DSO, under human resources at that point. In terms of my interactions, I think when I first started at DW, I have a different perspective than what I have now as ADA coordinator. For me, Title I and Title II of the ADA are very different, rightfully so, right? Title I is about employment, and there are different accommodations you need to do in the employment setting. And accommodations can be with an employee for as long as they work at this institution. Diane was here for 18 years, right? I've only been here for 11. There's many of us who know people who've been here for 30 years, right? So that kind of accommodation process has to, it can be very nuanced and can change, right, based off what those environments are. So that being separate just from a processing the access items and implementing it, maybe across different workspaces, needs its own dedicated area of focus and skill set. Unlike the student accommodations, so we still have a long history, right, with the student, but they're only in it for a quarter and then they change their classes again. And there's similarities across classes, right, which has some parallel in the employment case, but not always. So I think when I started, I was a little more frustrated. So student employees had to go somewhere different, but I've evolved into they're very different in terms of what our obligations are and the expertise that is needed to effectively implement those accommodations. It was why we need two subject matter offices that are different. And we are not an institution like some of our peers, University of Minnesota, University of Arizona, for example, who have put everything under one where they have upwards of 80 or 90 people, right, collectively that do everything accessibility. We are not that model at this institution. I don't know that we'll ever move to that model. So our model is we have two distinct subject matter offices, and we meet the obligations, right, that each are required to facilitate. The naming is hard. I mean, DSO, DRS, that's confusing. So maybe we'll change that eventually. But I see the obligation as being different and unique enough to have two different offices, which makes it hard for that employee, which is, I think, one of your kind of underlying root questions here, right? Like a student employee has to go to two different locations. So we try to do our best, if they were a DRS student, to also have information, right, shared and transferred to the employment office. But we also tell them you might need different things, right, as an employee than you have as a student. So you might need to provide different answers to questions. And that's just the reality, unfortunately, right? As being a person with a disability, you have to share information that's relevant in the environment you're trying to get access to. But you can correct me, Heather, on that one.
Not at all. Certainly not in this space. I'll save that discussion for later. Yeah. Kathy.
What I was going to add to that, and this may be different now, when I was here, I scheduled all the sign language interpreters for all of the students. And during the tenure, they hired an interpreter coordinator who then scheduled interpreters for students and staff. So I'm not sure if that's still the same, but that is one area where there is a merge.
And I was going to say that we met on a regular basis, weekly actually, DRS and DSO and the ADA coordinator, because we recognized some of this fragmentation, and we wanted to try to make sure that our systems, as best as we could, were, user friendly, so to speak, and that we weren't putting people through hoops here that they didn't have to necessarily go through because they've already gone through the hoops over there. And then the other thing that I wanted to say is that we also have two other college campuses, Bothell and Tacoma. And so when I started getting calls from the directors there, and I'm like, why are we not doing this together? We could be doing possibly different things and confusing students who can go to all three of our campuses and take classes. So I went to Helen and said, Helen, can we create a meeting for all the tri-campuses and try to figure out our systems so that, again, the students aren't having to go, repeat, and possibly we can support accommodations together as well. So those are ways that we were already recognizing there's like this fragmentation going on. How can we at least try to bring some of it together to make it a little more smooth for the students and the faculty and staff that were using our services?
Well, and we've certainly covered in some prior podcasts the pretty exceptional level of activism and advocacy at the University of Washington throughout its history. And I think that this really goes back to talking about coalition building, allies, and certainly the incredible resilience and foresight of a lot of the students that have come through this campus, and I count myself among them, having never left, apparently.
Yay.
Well, ladies, I just want to thank all three of you and individually each of you for the work that you did on our campus, the work you're continuing to do. And again, I'll just come back to very selfishly the degree to which I personally have benefited from the foundations that you've laid and the work that you've done, and what a privilege it has been to spend a little bit of time with you, to hear about your stories and to understand our collective story a little better.
Thank you so much for having us, Heather.
Really appreciate the time and opportunity.
Lovely to meet you. Good luck.
Great.
With your time here, doing more beautiful work for our campus and disability, work.
Good to be here. See you all next time.